So welcome everyone. This is the Population, Family, and Reproductive Health Master's Essay Presentation, and this is session 1. And I'm Susan Gross, and it's my pleasure to host this today. And I'm very excited because all of our students I've had a lot of contact with, and I'm excited to see their presentations. We will start with Rishitha Chintala. She comes to us with a Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery in Medicine from Dr. NTR University of Health Sciences and a Master's in Public Health from the University of Hyderabad. And her area of interest was maternal, fetal, and perinatal health. And her title is Quality of Family Planning Care Among Women Wishing to Delay or Space Pregnancies in Rajasthan, India. And go ahead.
Very good morning to everyone. Sorry for the delay. It's my pleasure to present my study findings to you all. And the topic of my presentation is quality of family planning care among women wishing to delay or space pregnancies in Rajasthan, India. India is home to nearly 19% of the world's population of reproductive age women. Therefore, it carries a great responsibility in achieving the SDG goal 3.7, which recognizes universal access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services. As of 2019, approximately 183 million Indian women of reproductive age expressed a desire to avoid pregnancy. However, on the contrary, 50 million did not use any modern contraceptive methods. This indicates a significant unmet need, prompting the need to prioritize the quality of family planning care for these women. This brings us to the definition and dimensions of quality of care. The World Health Organization defines quality of care as the degree to which health services for individuals and populations increase the likelihood of desired health outcomes. By desired health outcomes, we mean to reduce the risk of unintended pregnancy that leads to maternal morbidity and mortality, and increasing utilization of modern contraception by improving contraceptive method choice. And this can be achieved using the different dimensions of the quality of care framework. In 1990, Bruce and Jane developed the quality of care framework, and this is the fundamental model to identify three basic domains. The one on the far left is the program effort, which is the structure or the service readiness. The middle component is the process, and both of these lead to the impact or the outcome. Specifically, Bruce and Jane elaborated on the middle components, that is this process, and identified 6 basic elements, of which we will be going to talk about information given to clients in our study. Client information refers to the information provided during service contact that helps clients choose and use contraception effectively. This is a snapshot of quality of family planning care in India. We see that India has severe method skewness towards female sterilization, and female sterilization comprises about 2/3 of the method mix. Recent studies have also observed increasing proportions of women expressing dissatisfaction and regret about sterilization services. And this leads us to an interesting question. Are women receiving proper counseling to choose the method of contraception? And this can be evaluated by the Method Information Index, which is a standardized index that captures the quality of counseling through providers' information about side effects, management of those side effects, and alternate available methods. Unfortunately, India has a low score of 40 out of 100, indicating poor quality of family planning. Previous studies underscored important deficiencies in quality of family planning counseling in India, and they offered limited insights on the determinants of poor quality. And this motivated us to select this topic. And we aim to evaluate the quality of family planning counseling by decomposing the Method Information Index into 3 elements and assessing that by patient and provider characteristics in India. For our study, we used the IPUMS PMA 2020 survey, and we restricted our sample to 994 women who were using contraception and began using the most recent methods in the last 5 years. And we excluded male sterilization. And we assessed 3 indicators of quality of family planning counseling as our outcomes, namely the side effects and the management of side effects. The second one is about information about alternate available methods. And the third one is the combination of these two, indicator of combined method choice. And we conducted logistic regression analysis for each of our outcomes. So this is a snapshot of the socio-demographics. Our sample had over 60%, our sample had over 60% of the respondents below 30 years of age. Almost half completed post-secondary education. Over 70% had 2 or more children, and 2/3 lived in rural areas. Coming to contraceptive sterilization, contraceptive utilization, female sterilization and barrier contraceptives were the most prevalent contraceptives used, accounting for 35% each. And about a third of the respondents received contraception from public healthcare facilities, followed by pharmacies. Then we conducted bivariate analysis to evaluate quality of care by contraceptive method and type of provider. When we look at the first column about side effects, we see that women using long-acting methods have a higher quality of care. They are being much more informed about the side effects. And when we see about the second and third columns, about the alternate methods available and the combined method choice, we observed that women using short-acting methods were more informed about alternate available methods and also the combined method choice. Coming to the type of provider, we see that women who receive services from the integrated child health services, the child health care centers, and the social health workers like the ASHAs received highest quality of counseling compared to the women who received care from the other types of providers. Later, we stratified our analysis based on our type of contraceptive method. So when we look at the first column about sterilization, we see that women who underwent sterilization received highest quality of counseling from private healthcare facilities when compared to government facilities. And the middle column is long-acting methods. We do not see significant results, and we see only a very few borderline significant results because of the small sample size. And because of small sample size, we had greater variance and wider confidence intervals. And coming to the third column about short-acting methods, we observe that women who have 2 or more children and who completed post-secondary education received higher quality of care. So we saw that counseling about alternate methods is much more common among women using short-acting methods and already having 2 or more children. So then comes the questions, then comes the question, is that an indicator of quality, or is that an indicator of provider bias? Previous studies show providers' preferences for intrauterine devices and sterilization to women with higher parity, that is with 2 or more children. And they also observed over-promotion of sterilization for women with 2 or more children. And this could lead to increased counseling for those considering alternate methods as found in our study. And women who received sterilization were least informed about alternate methods and had the poorest method choice. And this finding was confirmed by a qualitative study in Rajasthan that observed normative expectations to limit family size to 2, influencing providers' practices, and community health workers getting incentivized to encourage sterilization for women after their second childbirth. Another interesting question is about the IPUM's PMA survey questionnaire. So in the figure on the right-hand side, we see a question about the possible side effects. And this question is the same for all the methods available. However, we see that the patterns of side effects and the ability to manage them vary considerably by the method, raising concerns about the question interpretability and the meaning of MI metric, which assumes similar counseling for all methods. And we also see that this question may not be particularly useful for women undergoing sterilization because they are at a risk of experiencing post-operative complications like septicemia, especially when the operation is conducted in unsafe and unhygienic conditions, which is happening in India. So overall, our results highlight for quality of care, especially poor quality of care for women using sterilization, but also question the validity of the instrument if it's being able to discern quality of care from provider bias. So the strengths of the study. So one of the major strengths is generalizability because the survey is a population-based survey, and it had the sample which is representative. And one of the limitations we observed was the third point. That is, initially we tried to evaluate the association between the preferred family planning method and the quality of care, but we couldn't do that because of a small sample size for this variable. The other limitations are temporality, lack of temporality, because we assessed the survey cross-sectionally, and social desirability bias, especially when there's discussion about sensitive issues like sexual health and family planning. And these are the references. I thank my mentor, Dr. Caroline Moreau, for her immense support and guidance, without whom this essay would not have been possible. I also thank Dr. Susan Cross, who has been my academic advisor and supporting me supporting me these 2 years. I would like to thank the IPUMS PMA, of course, for allowing me to extract the data, and of course, colleagues, family, and friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rishitha. Wonderful presentation. Are there any questions? Questions for Rishitha? Well, I'll ask one question. In response to the provider bias, and did you see evidence of this provider bias in the literature about other places who had provider bias, especially around sterilization?
Yeah, so what I found that is in previous literature, there has been evidence of provider bias, especially to women with higher parity. So women having 2 or more children were um, were were particularly more advised to opt sterilization and long-acting methods. And this was observed among community health workers and the traditional birth assistants, and also among doctors.
Great job. It was a lot of information to provide in a short period of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
And
much. Thank you.
if there aren't any other questions, we will move on. go ahead. Did someone have a question? We'll go on to the next speaker.
Okay.
So our next presenter is Dory Bittle. Dory comes to us with a Bachelor of Science in Applied Developmental Psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. Her area of interest is maternal, fetal, and perinatal health. And the title of her essay is Evaluating the Implementation of a Personal Agency-Based Youth, Sexual, and Reproductive Health and Rights Curriculum and its effect on personal agency outcomes among out-of-school young people ages 10 to 25 in Masindi, Uganda, a proposal.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. So thank you for that introduction, Dr. Gross. Today, I will be presenting my master's essay titled A Personal Agency-Based Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Curriculum, a proposal to evaluate its implementation and outcomes among young people in Masindi, Uganda. I want to first acknowledge my primary reader, Dr. Anita Shankar, for her support throughout this process, and my population, family, and reproductive health advisor, Dr. Susan Gross, for her ongoing guidance the last 2 years. So today we will be going through some background on the current state of sexual and reproductive health in Uganda, as well as current interventions, the objective and the aims of the evaluation, its methods, its metrics and its analyses, its strengths and limitations, and finally, its budget. So adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa bear a large burden of sexual and reproductive health challenges, and Ugandan youth mirror many of these challenges. 1/3 of the Ugandan population is less than 24 years old. Almost 20% of adolescent girls have had a live birth, and almost 20% of girls and 15% of boys have been found to be affected with a sexually transmitted infection. Psychosocial interventions are promising approaches for addressing some of these challenges. Specifically, personal agency approaches defined as interventions that help individuals to understand how their thoughts, beliefs, values, and emotions impact their actions, have effectively addressed sexual and reproductive health in the past, but currently youth lack behavioral interventions directly addressing personal agency. So the Johns Hopkins Self-Empowerment and Equity for Change Initiative, or C-Change, is dedicated to fostering personal agency through research and programs, particularly in resource support contexts. And early randomized controlled trials of the C-Change initiative have shown positive effects on aspects like income generation, self-efficacy, and overall well-being. So this past summer, I was able to spend 3 months in Masindi, Uganda, partnering with a local Ugandan nonprofit called Shine's Children's Foundation. And we adapted a C-Change personal agency curriculum to a new context, a new population, and a new topic area. And the context being Masindi, the population being out-of-school youth ages 10 to 25, and the content being sexual and reproductive health and rights. So together with the Shine's Children's Foundation team and the Johns Hopkins C-Change team, we developed a 9-module curriculum that included resources for didactic sexual and reproductive health information, as well as embedded personal agency-based activities and exercises. And here's the full list of the curriculum modules. In September, we were able to pilot 2 of the activities of the tailored curriculum with a small sample of in-school and out-of-school youth. And initial feedback from the youth on the activities demonstrated positive effects on youth personal agency competencies of sexual self-responsibility and empathetic negotiation. However, further research is necessary to systematically evaluate the effectiveness of the full intervention before considering it for a wider implementation. So the purpose of this evaluation would be to explore the implementation of a personal agency-based curriculum designed for out-of-school youth at the individual program and community levels using the RE-AIM implementation framework. And for clarity throughout this proposal, young people will refer to individuals aged 10 to 25. The first aim of this proposal is to evaluate the adoption, implementation, and maintenance of the personal agency curriculum at the program and community levels over a 4-month implementation period. And the second aim is to evaluate the curriculum's effectiveness, reach, and individual maintenance of outcomes throughout the same 4-month implementation period. So just for a little level setting, REAIM is a validated evaluation framework that stands for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance, and serves as a way to guide data collection. REAIM can be broken down into program level domains, which are adoption, implementation, and maintenance of program activities, as well as individual measures of reach, effectiveness, and maintenance of individual effects past the end of implementation. So for this evaluation, I was considering the limited resources that we might have. So I opted for a quasi-experimental pre-post design with a non-equivalent control group and using propensity score matching as a way to balance the intervention in the control groups. And after an ethical review by Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, and the Johns Hopkins University ethical review, participants will be conveniently sampled from village youth groups already engaged in some sort of income-generating programming by Shine's Children's Foundation. These groups will ideally integrate a personal agency-based curriculum into their bi-weekly workshops and form our intervention group. The control group will consist of either village youth groups similar in size and Shine's Children's Foundation income generating workshop frequency. Once participants complete a full assent and consent process, baseline data on age, education, prior sexual and reproductive health programming, and personal agency scores will be collected by a local research team. The intervention group will then receive nine curriculum sessions administered by trained staff over 4 months, and the control group will not receive the intervention, but will continue to receive their usual income-generating programming. At the end of the 4-month intervention period, an end-line survey will collect data on personal agency scores from the intervention and control group. And then finally, after 6 months after the intervention end, a follow-up survey will be administered to intervention and control participants to collect personal agency scores once again. So for each of the REAIM categories, I've outlined a construct, metric, and data source. For aim 1, today I will highlight implementation and the specific implementation construct context, which will be measured through a qualitative data method called community-based systems dynamic sessions with youth and facilitators of the curriculum. So CBSD sessions will be 3-hour recorded sessions led by a Makerere researcher. These recorded sessions will dive into factors inhibiting and supporting the delivery of the curriculum. And following CBSD sessions, we'll craft a systems model in collaboration with the participants of the sessions, much like the one you see on the screen right now. And here are the remaining REAIM domains. And today, again, I will just highlight the effectiveness domain, which will be measured using personal agency scales of internal beliefs, internal skills, and external skills. And those scales were provided by the validated tool titled Cital Amplify Girls. With this tool, we will assess the intervention recipient's baseline to endline personal agency change and compare that to non-recipients. The Cital Amplify agency tool was selected because of its development using community participatory processes in East Africa. And this tool is a 60-item questionnaire available in multiple East African languages, and it really aligned with the Sea Change Personal Agency framework. And additionally, it has shown validity among a similar sample. For analysis, for aim 1, we will analyze mixed methods. Basic calculations will be reported and qualitative data will be coded and analyzed using an online software. For aim 2, we will analyze only quantitative data, and after calculating program reach, we will produce descriptive statistics from the baseline data, which inform the calculation of propensity scores for matching intervention and control groups. And once those groups are matched, we will conduct a difference in difference analysis and test its significance using a t-test. Finally, regression analyses will be used to understand how different levels of implementation may have affected the intervention's effectiveness. And again, a little level setting. So for those unfamiliar with the difference in difference design, it is an analysis technique that looks at the change in an outcome from before the intervention to after the intervention and then compares these differences between a group that received the intervention and a group that did not receive the intervention. So the strengths of this proposed evaluation are that it addresses gaps in evaluation literature, it uses mixed methods and triangulates data to provide a richer results section, and the on-the-ground information will help inform future scale-up efforts of this curriculum. Some weaknesses of the evaluation design is the convenient sampling, which may introduce selection bias, the choice to use a quasi-experimental design as opposed to the gold standard randomized control trial may introduce some confounding variables. The intervention group size may be limited due to the need to receive consent and assent for minors. The political climate in Uganda currently rejects homosexuality, which could affect the fidelity of the curriculum delivery. And then lastly, the validity of the Societal Amplified Personal Agency scales. It has only been validated among girls aged 10 to 25, but in this we will be using it among boys. And then very quickly, we'll go through the budget. So the total budget of the evaluation will be roughly $85,000. Which will be made up of around $22,000 for the local team to implement and evaluate the intervention, and around $44,000 for Johns Hopkins Sea Change evaluation support and oversight. Thank you so much for listening to this proposal, and I am now happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dory. Very interesting proposal. Are there any questions for Dory? Go ahead and speak up if you have a question.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask a question. Dory, can you say a little bit about what the challenges that you faced when you were out in the field and working with the SHINE team and connecting with the youth and what you observed when you were there?
Yes, so I would say the biggest challenge that I observed when I was there was probably generating buy-in from adult stakeholders. We were able to do a piloting session with the adult stakeholders prior to piloting it with youth. And there was just a lot of pushback on, especially when thinking this curriculum was designed for out-of-school youth, but the pilot with youth was going to be involving in-school youth. So there was a lot of pushback on kind of what content we could share with youth in school, because there's a different set of expectations for the sexual and reproductive health information in-school youth can receive versus out-of-school youth. But even among out-of-school youth as well, because of the current political climate in Uganda, a lot of the concerns from potential providers of this curriculum were that they were somehow going to get in trouble with the Ugandan government if for any reason the Ugandan government felt like they were promoting homosexuality in any sort of way. So we really had to find ways to like tiptoe around that and really kind of meet the communities and the country where they were at, and sort of respect the fears and validate the fears that these potential providers of this curriculum had. So I would say that was one of the biggest challenges. It took a lot of workshopping with the local team and a lot of communication with the stakeholders to kind of figure out the best avenues to still deliver an effective curriculum. So, yes, thank you for your question.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hey, Susan, I can go. Asta here. Well done, Dory. That was a really good presentation. I think for me, I'm thinking about it in terms of implementation science and what that program entails and what was part of that program to observe that change. And one of the things when you were going through your presentation was I felt that the curriculum is very much focused on the individual without taking stakeholder buy-in from like parents. And from what I'm understanding, your outcome is going to be personal agency. So the question that I have is, to what extent do you think that this intervention is going to change personal agency, firstly, without stakeholder buy-in? And then secondly, if there are any other outcome variables that you have thought about beyond personal agency?
Yes, good question. Or good questions. So I would say one thing that is like very unique about this kind of framework and this personal agency framework is that it's based in psychology and cognitive science. So there's a lot of like CBT practices interwoven into the curriculum. But one thing that's interesting is that it is delivered in a group format and a group setting. So it kind of takes the curriculum outside of like the individual like therapeutic space and provides it in this group setting where they're kind of growing individual agency while also growing collective agency as well. And I think that is a strength of the curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum because it kind of interweaves potential like peers and potential social networks into this kind of personal agency development. So there is kind of that natural integration of other potential influences in an individual's life in the generation of this personal agency. And then your second question about other outcomes that I considered. For this evaluation, I was looking directly at personal agency outcomes, just in order to kind of capture whether the curriculum is effectively driving a change in personal agency. But ideally, I would like to look at maybe how these changes in personal agency might be related to like different sexual and reproductive health behaviors and relationship behaviors in like a longer term evaluation. I think most immediately though, what I was most interested in is this curriculum at all changing how youth exhibit or display or feel about personal agency, and then hopefully down the road another follow-up evaluation could be done to see if that has any effect on actual health behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dory. That was wonderful. Great response to questions. And I think we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jada Parker. She comes to us with a Bachelor of Sciences in Nutritional Sciences from the University of Arizona. Her area of interest was maternal, fetal, and perinatal health. And her presentation today is paternal involvement and its influence on social, cognitive, and emotional development of children from birth to pre-K, a systematic review.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gross, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Arizona. My name is Jada Parker, and today I'm honored to present my research on paternal involvement and its influence on the social, cognitive, and emotional development of children from birth to pre-K, presented as a systematic review. Today, I'll be going over an introduction and purpose for my research, methods I used, results for my findings, a discussion, limitations, and future directions. So one of the main drivers for my interest in this research was that within the field of child development, studies on maternal involvement in child development have dominated the research, and studies on paternal involvement in child development have yet to be explored at the same depth. However, growing evidence has demonstrated a strong association between paternal or father involvement and child developmental outcomes. Fathers uniquely contribute to the development of their children through their involvement in their lives, whether quantitatively, such as through father engagement in day-to-day activities, or qualitatively, such as through level of closeness, trust, and emotional support. These formative years from birth to early childhood are both critical and sensitive stages that are the basis for social, cognitive, and emotional functioning throughout the life course, and they influence multiple aspects of life, such as mental and physical health, that ultimately impact an individual's overall health in later adulthood. Research proves that a father's influence has a significant impact on the child's development. Father-child relationships that are positive and described as close, nurturing, and accessible report children having better peer relationships, social competence, stronger emotional resilience, and higher academic performance, while father-child relationships that are more negative and described as a distant, negligent, or conflictual report children experiencing difficulties in their social interactions, increased feelings of anxiety and depression, and lack of academic motivation. A father's upbringing and lack of traditions in their a father's upbringing and the premise for how the fathers pass down their values and beliefs and cultural traditions to their children influence parenting practices and disciplinary methods, and also their expectations for behavior within the family. It also shapes his understanding of child development and therefore influences his expectations for his children, social interactions, milestones, and academic achievement. So therefore, although evidence demonstrates that paternal involvement is multidimensional and influenced by a variety of factors, there has not been a systematic review recently of the research about father involvement and its influence on child development from birth to pre-K. Previous systematic reviews have not fully explored how the degree of father involvement impacts the development of a child according to social, cognitive, and emotional domains. A focus on overall child developmental outcomes does not consider the qualities or dynamics of these father-child relationships and how they contribute to a child's development according to the specified domains. My review will synthesize relevant research from the last 5 years with a special focus on trends and gaps that exist within the field and the current direction of that research and where it is going. The review will be structured by separately considering outcomes in 3 domains of childhood development that are social, cognitive, and emotional. Additionally, the review will examine findings about the influence of paternal background and attitudes on their degree of involvement, thus affecting their child's developmental outcomes. For my methods, the criteria for my search included studies that were peer-reviewed, journal articles, published in English, published within the last 5 years, and involving paternal figures with a biological relation. I located my studies using 3 databases, PubMed, EBSCOhost, and Scopus, and utilized the following blend of search terms within the title, abstract, and keywords. The initial search yielded 1,067 studies, and I then performed a mechanical screen that removed studies related to or whose outcome was related to adverse birth outcomes, which included terms like syndrome and disorder, or were a result of a situational or environmental related issue, such as displacement due to a natural disaster. And that ultimately disqualified 808 studies. And of the remaining studies, I then performed a hand screen that removed studies due to a lack of evidence or had outcomes related to the topics outside of the review, which include outcomes focused on the perception of paternal involvement, outcomes related to well-being or quality of life, outcomes focused on both parents, focus involving father or child disorders or disabilities, or focus on paternal depression as a factor. Ultimately, only 13 articles met all criteria guidelines and were reflective of the current literature in the field. So now going through some of the results. For study design, the majority of the selected studies had a longitudinal design at 69%, followed by cross-sectional and then experimental. Of all 13 studies, they used primary data with most data sets obtained from birth cohorts from the population of interest. And these data sets all featured a cohort design, which means that a sample population was selected from existing birth cohort studies where children and their families were followed and assessed periodically over a given time frame. Most of the studies selected for this review took place in Asian countries at 46%. Of these, half of which took place in Japan. And the second largest group of studies took place in the Americas. Regarding domain allocation, most studies focus on a mix of domains at 62%, but 23% focused solely on the cognitive domain and 15% focused only on the emotional domain. And as you can see from this bar graph, interestingly, there were no studies that exclusively focused on social development and paternal involvement. For longitudinal studies that observed development at various points in time, 23% were assessed during the infant-toddler range, 15% between the toddler pre-K range, and 31% between the infant and pre-K range. Of cross-sectional studies, no studies solely associate or assess the children's development in the infancy stage, and 8% in the toddler stage and 15% in the pre-K stage. And the single experimental study focused only on children in the infant and toddler stages. When considering paternal history and background, most studies did not specify this aspect, and in the few that did, they mentioned that traditional patriarchal norms had an influence on paternal presence and participation in child rearing. And when considering paternal attitudes, the studies indicated that a positive perspective about parenting was associated with a higher degree of paternal involvement. Additionally, the degree of paternal engagement in stimulating play, both mentally and physically, for example, reading or partaking in language building activities or childcare activities, was associated with child developmental outcomes. When considering developmental outcomes for the social domain of interest, of the 13 studies, none of them solely focused on this single domain. For the cognitive domain, the frequency of paternal support was found to be associated with child developmental outcomes, and aspects that constituted positive or negative outcomes pertain to how involved fathers were in performing childcare-related tasks such as bathing, putting to sleep, playing at home, changing clothes, and feeding. Furthermore, paternal availability and responsiveness to their child and consistency influence academic and executive functioning skills. Paternal mind-mindedness was another aspect that several studies highlighted, and mind-mindedness is a developmental psychology concept described as the caregiver's tendency to view their child with a mind that has individual thoughts and feelings, which enables them to interpret their child's actions and behaviors as meaningful and driven by their mental states. And from that, fathers who appropriately commented on their child's emotional state, especially moments of distress, had children who were more likely to be able to self-regulate effectively and demonstrate improved problem-solving capabilities. In the emotional domain, positive reinforcement and assurance demonstrated by paternal teaching of learned behaviors, engagement in play, and communication increased emotional security within children. And constructive guidance on navigating emotions suggested that presence during these moments were crucial for children to have improved emotional awareness. To further understand whether the literature considered the quantity and quality of father involvement and its influence on child development, quantitatively, the amount of time a father spent with their child was associated with child developmental outcomes. Fathers who were more accessible and available to their children were more likely to predict a positive developmental trajectory for their children. When considering the quality of father-child relationships, active involvement in a variety of activities with the child had positive implications, and paternal inconsistency and coerciveness had negative implications. After considering these results, we then can discuss the trends and gaps within the field and determine what can be said about the qualities and dynamics of father-child relationships. The review of the research confirms what we have seen in previous studies, that the father's involvement matters in the social, cognitive, and emotional development of their children. However, there remains a gap in understanding the nuanced dynamics between paternal involvement and child outcomes, particularly in terms of the quality and degree of fatherly engagement. It is important to highlight that the criteria of this review only found 13 studies in 5 years on father involvement and child development, which suggests more research is needed in this field. Notable gaps in the research include greater recognition of the impact of a father's childhood, background, and upbringing and its influence on these domains. Another gap in the research is that most of the studies did not consider the concept of varying masculinity ideologies and perceptions and how they influence child developmental outcomes. And understanding how notions of masculinity impact fathers' perceptions of themselves as caregivers, their willingness to express emotions, and their approaches to parenting could illuminate barriers to nurturing and involved parenting. Moreover, examining the effects of masculinity concepts on children's development provides a critical lens through which to understand how gender roles and gender norms may shape children's socialization, emotional well-being, and cognitive growth. Another gap the studies didn't look at was the impact of cultural ideas on gender roles and norms and their influence. The studies were cross-sectional, which was good, meaning that this topic is being researched in various cultures, but more research can build a stronger case for how cultural influences affect degrees of paternal involvement and child development. Finally, delving into qualitative work about fathers' perspectives, motivations, and experiences of fatherhood can uncover the diverse ways in which fathers engage with their children and the factors that influence their involvement. In conducting the systematic review, several limitations were encountered that warrant mentioning. Firstly, despite efforts to comprehensively search multiple databases and both a mechanical and hand screen being conducted, there remains a possibility of missing relevant studies. And secondly, the inclusion criteria may have introduced selection bias as studies meeting specific eligibility criteria were prioritized, potentially excluding valuable data from divergent perspectives not considered in the search criteria. Third, I chose 5 years as a search criteria, but perhaps a 7 to 10-year period would have been more representative of recent literature. Finally, while efforts were made to minimize bias during data extraction and synthesis, subjective interpretation and judgment may have influenced the analysis and interpretation of findings. So the question remains then, where does the research go from here? Research dedicated to understanding what constitutes a father's perspective and attitude toward their investment in their child's development could be one direction of the research. Another could be cultural relevance and dynamics. Research on cultural relevance and how it influences the dynamics of father's involvement in father-child relationships could be another. And qualitatively, that research focused on exploring the underlying processes, experiences, and perceptions that shape father-child relationships and character traits that the father exhibits could be another future direction of this research. This concludes my presentation. I wanted to give special thanks to my reader, Emmy Hughes, my advisor, Mary Catherine Augustine, and my program director, Kristen McCormick. Without these women and their relentless support and keeping me on track, I would have not been able to accomplish this. And so I really thank you ladies for your support. And at this time, I will open up the floor for any questions.
Thank you, Jada. That was excellent. I'm not sure if it's a question. I saw that Aspa made a comment about did you look at whether there were differences in outcomes between single fathers and those in dual parent households?
So
And
that's actually a very great question. Hindsight's 2020. As I was finalizing my results and looking and having actually a conversation with my reader, Emmy Hughes, we had talked about that. It's like, wow, that's probably something that if I were to do this again, I would have highlighted that aspect, because obviously not all father-child relationships are the same. And so considering their differences in the ways of whether their parents or their father figure is there or not would be definitely important. So I would say, to answer that, in retrospect, I would say that's something to consider further.
and another question by Esther was, were there any studies on non-heteronormative relationships?
Non-heteronormative, could you describe what you mean by that?
Asa, do you want to come up?
Yes, of course. So I mean, understanding father or paternal involvement amongst those who are homosexuals or trans or queer, or who are not in a relationship with a mother and a father.
Interestingly enough, of my research, I didn't exclude those from my study, but the studies that resulted from my search, they did not exclusively state that or included that population. And so that is actually another future direction where the research could go, is to be very much more inclusive of those heteronormative relationships, for sure.
Are there any other questions? You did an amazing job, Jada. That was a lot of information to bring
Thank you.
forward, and it's exciting to see what direction this will all lead. All right, so that brings us to our final presenter today. Our last presenter is Elena Kern. She comes to us with a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies in Psychology from the University of Denver. Her area of interest is adolescent health, and her presentation is Reforming Labor Laws to Reduce Stunting in Ecuador.
Does everybody have the right view of my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena, and I'll be presenting today on the potential changes to labor law in Ecuador that could be made to support early childhood nutrition and to reduce stunting in children under 2. First, I'd like to tell you why I chose this issue. During my field placement in Ecuador in the fall, I noticed that the national strategy to reduce childhood stunting focused on maternal health and primary care, rightfully so, but it did not involve the labor sector, and I was curious to explore what those gaps could be. So in this presentation, I'll cover an overview of stunting, its magnitude in Ecuador and its key determinants, as well as the labor sector policies that are relevant to women, their partners, and their young children, and my recommendations in order to close some of those gaps. Stunting refers to impaired growth and development that children experience from poor nutrition, repeated infection, and inadequate psychosocial stimulation, per the World Health Organization definition. In short, it refers to low height for age. Stunting rates have been falling in Ecuador since 2004 in general, when 28.9% of children under 5, 33.9% between the ages of 2 and 3, and 21.3% of children under 2 were stunted. The most recent national survey on childhood stunting from Ecuador shows that now 17.5% of children under 5, 16% of children ages 2 to 5, and 20% of children under 2 are stunted. And I highlighted the under 2 data to show you that even though the World Health Organization has different data than the Ecuadorian administrative information, regarding the under 2 reduction, you can see that there's hardly been any reduction and it's not considered significant. So this is a graphic that pertains to the under 2 population. This is a graphic from the most recent administrative survey called ENDI. It shows the vast regional differences in stunting prevalence. The dark purple areas are where stunting ranges from about 25% to about 35%. And the light purple areas, it ranges from about 10% to about 13%. And you can see in the center of the map, the rural Central Highlands, and also on the right side of the map, the rural Amazon region are the most severely affected by stunting. And they also have concentrated populations of indigenous ethnicities in Ecuador, which are also disproportionately impacted by stunting. The under 2 population has the highest rates of stunting, and that seems to have been resistant to the interventions so far that have worked for the slightly older age groups. Between all age groups, rural areas experience stunting at significantly higher rates than urban areas. Indigenous children experience stunting at rates at least 30% higher than other ethnic groups. And out of all geographic regions, as I told you, the rural highlands and the rural Amazon are the most affected. So these are some of the key determinants and the consequences of stunting. In a nutshell, as much as I could condense this, because there are many. The main determinants of stunting are poor maternal nutrition and health, improper breastfeeding practices, repeated infections, chronic malnutrition during the fetal and early childhood periods, and insufficient meal quality and frequency. So if a child under 2 is getting the correct quality of nutrients, they still might not be getting meals at the right frequency, especially if that parent or both are constrained in some way by their employer to provide that. Too low frequency of meals between the ages of 6 and 12 months was even associated with over 3 times the rate of stunting compared with those who had the appropriate frequency. And the consequences of stunting are far-reaching. It can result in issues with organ development, impaired cognitive abilities, impaired immune function, increased blood pressure, higher risk of non-communicable diseases, among other lifelong complications. And it can also perpetuate a generational cycle of stunting, particularly in women who will bear children. So I want to highlight this generational cycle that can occur. This slide depicts the process for girls. It involves undernourishment as a fetus, stunting during development, adolescent pregnancy, being overworked during pregnancy, having infants of low birth weight, and being unable to optimally breastfeed. I hope this helps to illustrate how labor conditions that disrupt maternal and infant nutrition or overwork the mother may perpetuate stunting in a population. So why labor law reforms? While Ecuador prioritizes stunting in national agendas, current approaches focus on nutrition and healthcare policies, neglecting the impact of labor laws on parents' ability to provide adequate nutrition to children under 2. So changes in labor laws should aim to provide sanitary and safe spaces for breastfeeding and childcare at workplaces. It should protect the food security of pregnant, postpartum, and breastfeeding women by protecting their job security. It should ensure the awareness of rights among employees and managers, and it should promote access to affordable legal representation for employees. Here, I will outline the key policies as they relate to parental leave, childcare centers, breastfeeding and sanitation, protection from discrimination, and knowledge and legal access. Regarding maternity leave, women are entitled to 12 weeks of paid leave, including 2 weeks before and 10 weeks after the birth of an infant, with an additional 3 months in the case of complications, such as an infant born with a severe disability. They can take 10 extra days if they underwent a C-section. And in Ecuador, about 45% of births are of women have undergone C-sections. They can take up to a year of unpaid sick leave, but to be eligible for any of this, the mother has to have worked continuously for 12 months prior. So if a woman who could not work for any reason, perhaps a previous pregnancy or due to leaving work to breastfeed her infant, she would not have been making payments into the Social Security system during that time, so she would not be eligible for this leave. Fathers are given up to 25 days of paid leave maximum, even in the case of a severe degenerative condition of the infant. And I'd like to draw your attention to the additional 5 days for a C-section birth and contrast that with the recovery time for a C-section, which is typically about 6 weeks. Continuing with the policy landscape, childcare centers are actually required at or near work sites with 50 or more employees. They can take children as young as 6 months up to 5 years. And the standards of care can vary widely. And women often breastfeed directly at the center while taking unpaid leave from work. In terms of breastfeeding and sanitation practices, women are entitled to 2 hours of paid leave per shift for 12 months. So out of an 8-hour shift, they would be able to take 2 of those hours paid to breastfeed. The Constitution gives them the right to a private, safe facilities to breastfeed. And also under the Constitution, all women, all people, including women and children, have the right to health as a fundamental principle. But a very low amount of workspaces have breastfeeding spaces. The most recent estimate I could find, although it was from 2011, it said that only 10% of workplaces had breastfeeding spaces. So obviously this might discourage women from breastfeeding at all during their shift, or they might choose to leave paid work entirely to feed their infant, increasing the risk of maternal food insecurity. In terms of protection from discrimination, it's prohibited to discriminate based on gender, health status, religion, pregnancy status, among other categories, including dismissal on those grounds. And the burden of proof is now on the employer as of 2020. It's now considered discrimination by default to fire a pregnant or lactating woman, and the burden is on the employer to prove that it wasn't discrimination. And lastly, workers have the right to free legal representation. There's an online form to report violations through the Public Defense Office. In some cases, there are mobile units that can go to rural areas and address people's concerns. Yet workers, managers, and especially HR departments, are often unaware of workers' rights. So these are the main recommendations that I would make to improve the existing, to improve the existing policies and support their intended impacts. First, regarding parental leave, given that 45% of all births are by C-section, I recommend extending the extra entitlement for C-section births to 2 paid weeks to replace the existing 5 days that fathers are given in the case of C-sections. In terms of childcare centers, they should have regulations that ensure that breast milk can be safely stored and training for sanitation practices to be followed when giving milk or other foods to young children, so that children under 2 can receive the frequency and the quality of meals that they need, free from microbial contamination. And to support safe and sanitary work conditions, work sites should have safe storage capacities for breast milk. They should have private, clean, dignified areas with clean water and soap that are not bathrooms to breastfeed. And the regulations should insert language that makes fathers eligible to use these provisions to feed children. And lastly, the rights of workers need to be made known. There should be required training on workers' rights for all workers and all managers, and these rights should be displayed in a written format in a highly visible area where the majority of workers are reasonably expected to be able to read this information. Also, the best method for reporting violations of workers' rights and the point of contact for the local legal representation should be displayed in a similar way. So my recommendations have a couple of limitations. First of all, they're based on the public sector participation, and I wasn't able to look at the public sector employment by region and contrast it with the other things I was able to look at by region. And this might leave out people who are working informally or part-time or working outside of the public sector because that's just their way of life. In terms of paternity leave, it was beyond my training to give the exact cost, although I did break it down more in the thesis itself based on the typical income that people have in different areas. And lastly, the data was difficult to describe over time because Ecuador has had many different surveys over the past 15 or so years. I want to acknowledge Asla Ramaya, my reader, who was available for guidance, feedback, troubleshooting, and was very flexible with anything that I needed. Luciana Armijos, who was my supervisor at CAF, and Betsabe Tello, who works at the Pontifical Catholic University in Ecuador, because they both gave me great guidance on the laws of Ecuador. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. Are there questions?
There's one in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so the question in the chat is if I would be able to address stunting in the workplace, which recommendation would I focus on and for which population? Others may disagree with me, but it really stuck out to me that women are facing this issue. And first of all, I say women and men, mothers and fathers, because that's the language that's used in the census. That's the language that's used in the research, but that's not how I regard people. I definitely consider them to be much more varied than just that. But women are given this, it seems, mutually exclusive choice to either stay in the workforce and continue to be paid and let their children have improper nutrition. They're very young children, under 2, to have improper nutrition, or to leave the workforce and sacrifice their income in order and their future eligibility to take leave in order to give their children the nutrition that they need. So for me, that stuck out as something that absolutely needs to be addressed. And if it's addressed through through especially increasing the storage capabilities of both the work site and the childcare centers to store breast milk. And obviously that requires a safe and reliable way for the woman to expel that breast milk or directly breastfeed. For me, that's the most important thing.
Any other questions for Elena? I have a question. um, so can you tell me what supplemental nutrition programs exist in Ecuador, and how are they, especially for the regions that you were showing us with the greatest stunting, how are they implemented there?
So what I know is that there are the supplemental nutrition programs have focused on I'm not sure if the word is micro or macronutrients, but giving nutrients that are that could be left out in effect development, such as vitamin A, but also making sure that very young children have their routine vaccinations. There's something called the prioritized package that is administered, I think, by the Ministry of Health, and that it's a comprehensive primary healthcare package that addresses pregnant women, newborns, and children up to a certain age. It might be 5, but don't quote me on that. So by supplemental nutrition, that's how I know that Ecuador is currently addressing that. And I think that's only been happening within the past maybe 5 years or so. Does that answer your question?
So the supplemental nutrition package that they have is for pregnant women through what age?
I'm actually not sure through what age it is. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but it's intended to reduce stunting in the under 5 and under 2 population. So I would assume that's geared toward around that age of 5. But it's not just nutrition. It's a lot of health services that they think could contribute to stunting if they're missed.
And do you know what the coverage is for those very indigenous groups that you pointed out in your
Specifically, like in the highest in the areas with the highest rates of stunting? I don't know specific to those regions, but I do know especially in the rural Amazon, the transportation issues are really significant. Canoe transportation is how you get from place to place. And I know that Ecuador is planning current work regarding getting health services out to the rural Amazon via canoe, but I don't know the details of it. Oh, and I can tell you that the Ministry of Public Health services about 60% of the Ecuadorian population in total. So the other 40%, they go to private providers, not necessarily the state providers, although they can.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of chat. Asta had a comment. Do we have time, Kristen, for one more question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so Asta asked if you're able to address stunting in the workspace, which recommendation would you focus on and for which population?
Susan, I think she addressed that.
Oh, I'm
But
sorry.
thank you.
Yeah, so I think this is fascinating, and stunting is such a big problem. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's the end of our presentations for this year. And thank you so much to all our presenters today and all of the people who came to support them. And we hope you join us again next year for the next cohort.